You don't need to know much history to be aware that wars were an almost constant part of life. For example, between 1337 and 1814, England and France were in a state of war for 260 years, more than half of the time. However, while there have been endless wars throughout history, not all of them have had the same impact on the modern world. In this video, I'm going to go through what I think are the 10 most important wars in history. Now, they aren't necessarily the wars that involve the most people or that span the greatest territory, but instead, the wars that have had the most visible impact on the world today. Number 10. The Gothic War of 376 to 382. This is one of the less famous wars on the list, but its impact was huge. The reason that the Gothic War of 376 to 382 is so important is because it was one of the key events that led to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Needless to say, the collapse of Rome was a long process, and there was no one single war that was the cause. That said, the Gothic War is often cited as the most important war in Rome's decline. It began in 376, when some of the Gothic tribes of Eastern Europe found themselves fleeing a new enemy, the Huns. The Huns had swept across the Gothic homelands, and the Goths were forced to flee. They arrived at the banks of the Danube River, the border of the Roman Empire, and pleaded for asylum. At the time, the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire was Emperor Valens, and he saw an opportunity in the refugees. Valens hoped that by settling the Goths in Roman lands, he might be able to pacify them and bolster his army with fresh recruits. He granted their request for asylum and permitted them to cross the river into Roman territory. However, as the Goths began crossing the Danube, things quickly started to go wrong. Corrupt Roman officials did a bad job of disarming their new arrivals, leaving them with their weapons. Another problem was that the Romans hadn't prepared to provide for such a large number of people. There wasn't enough food, and many Goths became so desperate that they sold their own children into slavery. Over time, the Goths became resentful towards the Romans. After just 1 year in 377, that resentment boiled over, and the Goths rose up in rebellion. Roman forces were sent to suppress the uprising, but the Goths were skilled in guerrilla warfare and were able to resist. As the rebellion continued, other disaffected groups joined the Goths, including ex-soldiers and slaves who saw a chance for liberation. The most important battle of the conflict came in 378 when Emperor Valens led an army to confront the Goths. He marched towards the city of Adrianople, where the main Gothic force had gathered. Without waiting for reinforcements, Valens recklessly ordered his troops in a battle on August 9th, 378. The Battle of Adrianople turned out to be a catastrophic defeat for the Roman forces. The Gothic cavalry outmaneuvered the Romans, and Valens himself was killed in the chaos, along with a significant portion of his army. That defeat was one of the worst in Roman history, and its effects were profound. Many regions were left defenseless, and the Goths were able to plunder them. Following Valens' death, a new emperor was appointed to rule the Eastern Roman Empire, Theodosius I. Theodosius took a more cautious approach when fighting the Goths, avoiding large-scale battles and instead engaging in minor skirmishes. Eventually, he realized that the best approach was actually diplomacy. Theodosius gradually began negotiating with the Gothic leaders, offering them land within the empire. The Goths were exhausted from years of war and accepted those terms, realizing that a negotiated settlement would provide more stability than continuing the fight. Eventually, in 382, Theodosius signed a formal treaty with the Goths, in which they were given lands in Thrace. So, why was the Gothic War so important in the fall of the Western Roman Empire? Well, for a start, the peace agreement that they made was the first time that an entire barbarian population was allowed to settle within Roman borders and not be Romanized. The Goths were permitted to live under their own leaders and make their own laws. That marked the beginning of a new chapter in Roman history, one in which the boundaries between Roman and barbarian became increasingly blurred. Another important consequence was that the Roman Empire began to rely more and more on Germanic troops for its military. As you would imagine, those men were less loyal to Rome. The Germanic men didn't have much commitment to Roman values and were more likely to defect or rebel. Many of those new soldiers were more loyal to their tribal leaders or ethnic groups than to the Roman state. Needless to say, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was an absolutely pivotal moment in human history. Europe was plunged into what became known as the Dark Ages, with a huge amount of technological progress lost. Some places, like England, actually became even less advanced than they had been before the Romans arrived, with techniques for steelmaking and producing pottery forgotten. Entire cities, like London, were abandoned. In fact, the reason that the highest priest in England is in Canterbury is because it was one of the few settlements that wasn't totally depopulated after the fall of Rome. Had it not been for the Gothic War, who knows how long the Western Roman Empire would have survived. The Eastern Empire survived another 1,000 years, so perhaps the Western half could have as well. Number 9. The Chinese Civil War. The reason for the Chinese Civil War being on the list is obvious. It is the reason that China became communist. If not for that, the worst famine in human history wouldn't have happened. I'm talking about the Great Famine of 1959 that killed more than 50 million people. If not for the Chinese Civil War, there wouldn't be the modern-day Cold War that exists between America and China. The Chinese Civil War is the reason that we are constantly hearing that China might invade Taiwan. The roots of the Chinese Civil War lay in the end of the Chinese Empire in the early 1900s. For most of China's history, it was an empire, but that collapsed in 1911 in what was known as the Xinhai Revolution. Following the fall of the empire, there was a power vacuum, and China became fragmented as regional warlords took power. There were numerous factions, all fighting with each other, but two of the most important were the communists led by Mao Zedong and the nationalists led by Sun Yat-sen. Those two groups actually worked together for a time to defeat the warlords and unite the country. However, the alliance was short-lived as both factions wanted to take control of all of China. That eventually culminated in a brutal purge in 1927. The new leader of the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, ordered a massacre of thousands of communists in Shanghai. Chiang thought that he was eliminating the communists as a threat and that he wouldn't need to worry about them anymore. He couldn't have been more wrong. That massacre triggered the Chinese Civil War. Initially, it looked like Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists would win. Chiang and his forces came very close to wiping out the communists in the mid-1930s. The communists were surrounded and on the verge of being destroyed. However, they just about managed to escape the encirclement and embarked on a grueling retreat that has come to be known as the Long March. Over 2 years, the communists walked about 9,000 kilometers. Of the 70,000 communists that started the journey, only 7,000, or about 10%, survived. At that point, the communists were all but defeated, and it looked like Chiang Kai-shek had won the Civil War and would take control of all of China. It was then that the Chinese communists were actually saved by the most unlikely of saviors, Japan. Japan had been gradually expanding its empire throughout the 1930s. In 1931, it invaded Manchuria, and over the next few years, it continued to take more Chinese territory. It was able to do that because China was so weak from the Civil War. Chiang Kai-shek had been employing a strategy of defeating the communists first, and once they were neutralized, he would fight the Japanese. However, as Japan was taking more and more territory, that strategy became extremely unpopular. Those surrounding Chiang wanted him to stop fighting the communists and focus on resisting Japanese expansion. Eventually, Chiang was taken prisoner by his generals and forced to agree to ally with the communists against the Japanese. All-out war with Japan broke out only 8 months later when Japanese and Chinese troops began firing at each other in Beijing. The war against Japan would take 8 years and temporarily stop the Civil War as both factions focused on fighting the Japanese. Eventually, in 1945, Japan surrendered after America dropped nuclear bombs on 2 Japanese cities. After Japan's defeat, the fragile truce between the nationalists and the communists quickly collapsed, and the Civil War restarted. The United States did try to broker a peace between the two sides, but both were determined to take absolute power. Initially, again, it looked like the nationalists would win, but with Soviet support, the communists were able to hold on. Mao and his generals fought a guerrilla war, and it proved very effective. The nationalists, on the other hand, had severe internal problems such as corruption and low morale. In 1948, the Communists launched a decisive campaign in Manchuria, which was a turning point in the war. Over the next few months, they were able to take the major cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and even Nanjing, the nationalist capital. Eventually, on October 1st, 1949, Mao declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. The Communists had won the Civil War and would go on to kill tens of millions of people in their attempt to create a communist utopia. The nationalists retreated to the island of Taiwan and continued to claim that they were the rightful government of all of China. Those conflicting claims still exist to this day and are the reason that China is constantly threatening to invade Taiwan. Overall, the Chinese Civil War has a huge effect on the world today. If the nationalists had won, all of China might be like Taiwan, allied with the West and built on freedom and democracy. Instead, we have a totalitarian, genocidal, one-party state that spies on its citizens and covers up pandemics that it creates. Number 8. The conquest of the Americas. The conquest of the Americas wasn't a single war, but multiple wars leading to the subjugation of much of Central and South America by the Spanish. The impact on the modern world is obvious. There are 20 Spanish-speaking countries. Every major country in the Americas, other than Canada, the USA, and Brazil, speaks Spanish. The Spanish conquest of the Americas began in 1492 when Christopher Columbus embarked on a westward voyage seeking a direct route to Asia. Instead of reaching Asia, Columbus landed in the Bahamas, where he encountered a world vastly different from Europe. He returned to Spain with news of his discovery, which inspired more explorers to travel to the New World. By the early 1500s, Spanish explorers and conquistadors were pouring into the Americas, lured by the prospect of adventure and immense wealth. In 1519, one of those conquistadors, Hernán Cortés, arrived on the eastern shores of present-day Mexico. Cortés had heard stories of the Aztec Empire, which was said to be incredibly rich in gold. To conquer the Aztecs, Cortés forged alliances with indigenous groups who were resentful of Aztec dominance. Those alliances provided him with warriors and information about the complex politics of the region. By late 1519, Cortés and his allies had reached Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. There, they were initially welcomed by the Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma II. Moctezuma, unsure of how to respond to these strange newcomers, allowed them to enter the city. However, the two sides quickly fell out. The Spaniards, with their superior weaponry, were able to take Moctezuma hostage and use him as a puppet to control the entire empire. Eventually, the Aztecs rebelled against the Spanish and forced them to flee Tenochtitlan. The Spanish suffered heavy casualties in what became known as the Noche Triste or Night of Sorrows. However, Cortés was determined not to give up. He regrouped his forces, gathered even more indigenous allies, and returned to besiege Tenochtitlan. After months of brutal fighting and starvation within the city, Tenochtitlan fell in 1521. With that, the Aztec Empire was defeated. The conquest of South America would begin only 11 years later in 1532. Another Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, arrived in what was then the Inca Empire, a vast civilization stretching from modern-day Colombia to Chile. Pizarro, like Cortés, saw opportunity in division. The Inca Empire was weak because there had recently been a civil war. Pizarro seized the opportunity and lured the Inca Emperor, Atahualpa, into a trap in the city of Cajamarca. Pizarro's men ambushed and captured Atahualpa, demanding a huge ransom of gold and silver for his release. Although the ransom was paid, Pizarro executed Atahualpa, and the Spaniards moved to capture the Inca capital, Cuzco. By 1533, the Inca Empire was totally subjugated. The Spanish conquest continued, and by the late 1500s, Spain's empire spanned from the Caribbean and Mexico in the north to the Andes of South America. The indigenous people paid a heavy price for the conquest. Whole populations were decimated by European diseases to which they had no immunity, such as smallpox. Many of the survivors were enslaved. some of the indigenous cultures were almost totally destroyed. For example, Cuzco was the capital of the Inca Empire, but now almost nothing remains of that civilization. There are no buildings and very few surviving objects. Almost all of the Inca treasure was melted down and shipped back to Spain. In place of the indigenous cultures, the Spanish brought their civilization, and that is still very visible today. Latin America is largely Spanish-speaking and Catholic. The Spanish also brought their architectural style, which can be seen in small towns all over the continent. We will never know how the continent might look if it hadn't been colonized by the Spanish. Unfortunately, what is certain is that a huge number of the indigenous population would have died from disease regardless. Number 7. The Second Punic War. Now for another war that relates to the Roman Empire. The Gothic War that I mentioned earlier was related to the fall of Rome, but the Second Punic War was a key part of Rome's rise. Needless to say, the impact of the Roman Empire on the world can be seen all over the place. For example, every time you refer to the months of July or August, you are inadvertently referring to the Roman emperors Julius Caesar and Augustus. We can also see the Roman Empire's impact on the world's languages. Over 2 billion people on the planet speak a language that is either derived from or influenced by Latin. Every day, the world's English, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and French speakers use words that come from ancient Rome. The relics of ancient Rome are also very visible all over the place, from Hadrian's Wall in the north of England to the Garni Temple in Armenia. There are numerous wars that I could have chosen to represent the rise of Rome, but the one that I've gone for is the Second Punic War. At the start of that war, Rome was one of 2 major powers in the Mediterranean, the other being Carthage. Carthage was actually more established than Rome and may even have been wealthier. However, by the end of the war, Carthage was on its knees, and Rome was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The roots of the Second Punic War, of course, lie in the first, which began in 264 BC. At the time, Carthage controlled the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, parts of western Sicily, and also areas in southern Spain. However, Carthage's power was about to be challenged by a rising force to the north. Rome was expanding fast. In the previous century and a half, it had brought the majority of Italy under its control, and now it was beginning to involve itself in Sicily. Carthage, seeing a threat to its sphere of influence, warned Rome to stay away from Sicily. However, the Roman Republic did not take orders from foreign powers, and so war was inevitable. The war broke out in 264 BC, and initially, it didn't actually go well for Rome. Fighting across the water in Sicily required a navy, which Rome didn't have. Roman power had been built on the back of its highly effective legions, so while it could fight any power on land, it wasn't equipped to fight a naval war. However, the Romans quickly learned how to fight this new kind of warfare. They captured Carthaginian ships and copied their design, mass-producing them on a scale that Carthage couldn't match. They also innovated, inventing new tactics like the Corvus that allowed them to pin their ships to the Carthaginians and cross over to fight in hand-to-hand combat. Eventually, after 23 years of war, Carthage surrendered and signed a humiliating agreement where it withdrew all claims to Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. It was also forced to pay huge war indemnities to Rome. One Carthaginian general, Hamilcar Barca, refused to accept peace with the Romans. He withdrew to the Carthaginian territories in southern Spain, and for the next decade, he fought to expand them. Hamilcar would die in an ambush in 228 BC, but before he died, he made his son swear an oath that they too would never accept peace with the Romans. It was an oath that they would loyally follow for their entire lives. The eldest of Hamilcar's sons was Hannibal, and he had been learning the art of war since he was a young boy. He and his brothers were enormously wealthy, and their territories in Spain were virtually independent of the Carthaginian state. In fact, the brothers were so powerful that in 218 BC, Hannibal was able to launch his own war against Rome, laying siege to Rome's allies in Saguntum in northeastern Spain. After an 8-month struggle, Hannibal was able to take the city, and from there he moved north. His army was composed of Carthaginians, mercenaries, allied Celtic tribes, and North African Numidians. Famously, he also took with him 40 African elephants. Hannibal managed to march his army over the Pyrenees, through hostile areas of Gaul, and then across the Alps into Italy. Once there, he defeated Roman armies in a series of battles, most notably at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. The Romans lost more than 100,000 men in just those 3 engagements. Cannae was particularly devastating. A lot of Rome's ruling elite were killed in the fighting, and some even questioned whether the Roman state had a viable future. However, Rome refused to negotiate, despite the almost supernatural genius of Hannibal on the battlefield. It not only managed to raise new armies, but even invaded Spain and Macedon to open new theaters of war and deprive Hannibal of supplies and reinforcements. Hannibal's strategy was to create a big alliance of Celts, Greeks, and Italian cities against Rome. However, Hannibal was only able to win over a few Italian allies, and because he had so few men, he was unable to protect them. The Romans knew that Hannibal couldn't match their resources and endless manpower, so they employed a strategy of attritional war. They harassed Hannibal's army while ensuring that the city of Rome itself was safe behind its walls. Eventually, the Roman general Scipio invaded North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return and defend Carthage. The final showdown would happen at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Scipio had studied Hannibal's tactics and now was going to use them against the Carthaginian general. He neutralized Hannibal's elephants, fought his infantry to a standstill, and turned his own Numidian allies against him. Zama would turn out to be one of Rome's greatest victories, and Carthage had no choice but to sue for peace. In the treaty that followed, it was stripped of all its overseas possessions and forced to pay a 50-year indemnity. Its fleet was limited to just 10 ships, and it was banned from having war elephants. The Second Punic War was over, having been a decisive victory for Rome. The legacy of the war was that it left Rome as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. It had been a close call, and Rome had come very close to disaster. In the end, it won and removed the last obstacle to becoming the world's first superpower. Number 6. The 7 Years' War. Now for another of the less famous wars on the list, the 7 Years' War was the war of the 1700s that was fought all over the world. In fact, it's often argued that the 7 Years' War was the first truly global war, the real World War I. The war had 3 main theaters. The first was in Europe, where Britain and Prussia fought the combined forces of France, Spain, Russia, and Austria. The other 2 theaters were North America and India, where it was just Britain and France fighting for dominance. As you can imagine, with all those theaters happening simultaneously, the war was very complicated. It actually started in North America when British and French settlers began to skirmish in the Ohio Valley. One of the most important men in starting the conflict was actually George Washington. The conflict escalated, and 2 years later, Britain and France formally declared war. That brought the war to Europe and ignited already existing tensions between the powers. France, Austria, and Russia wanted to curb the growing power of Prussia, so they prepared to attack. With Britain already at war with France, and France on the verge of war with Prussia, Britain and Prussia formed an alliance to counter the French-led coalition. The war in Europe started in August of 1756 when Frederick the Great of Prussia launched a preemptive invasion of Saxony. France and Austria did try to retaliate, but they were unable to match the talent of Frederick on the battlefield. In 1758, he achieved a series of remarkable victories, defeating much larger armies due to his superior battlefield tactics. Meanwhile, in North America, the French were actually getting the upper hand against the British. With the aid of Native American allies, they won significant victories, taking the important fort of William Henry. However, in India, Britain won a hugely important victory at the Battle of Plassey, which effectively gave it control of Bengal. 1758 was a turning point in the war in North America. British Prime Minister William Pitt implemented a new strategy, focusing more on colonial theaters, particularly North America. The British began to gain ground, capturing key French forts, which cut off French forces from their supply lines. In Europe, Prussia's situation was dire as Russian forces invaded. Frederick was fighting on all sides, but he just about held on through a combination of skill, resilience, and financial support from Britain. 1759 was so pivotal that it came to be known as the Annus Mirabilis, or Year of Miracles. In North America, British forces captured the fortress of Quebec, which secured British control over Canada. Also, British naval forces triumphed over the French at the Battle of Quiberon Bay, securing Britain's naval supremacy and crippling France's ability to reinforce its overseas colonies. In Europe, Frederick won a significant victory at the Battle of Minden, which put France and its allies on the defensive. Although Britain and Prussia had gained the upper hand, the conflict dragged on. Frederick's resources were nearly exhausted, and Prussia was suffering from relentless Austrian and Russian attacks. Then, in 1762, a sudden and unexpected event altered the course of the war. Empress Elizabeth of Russia died, and her successor, Peter III, came to power. Peter was a great admirer of Frederick and withdrew Russia from the war. That was a desperately needed lifeline for Frederick of Prussia, and it allowed him to concentrate on fighting France and Austria. By 1763, the European powers were exhausted and financially drained. Peace negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Paris, which saw France cede its territories in North America to Britain. In Europe, Prussia secured its control of Silesia, solidifying its position as a major European power. So, how does the 7 Years' War affect the world today? Well, it's one of the biggest reasons that English is the lingua franca of the world. The 7 Years' War kicked France out of North America, and as a direct result, both the United States and Canada are almost entirely English-speaking. The 7 Years' War was perhaps the most important war in Britain becoming the dominant global empire. By the end of the war, its naval supremacy was undisputed, and it was free to colonize India. Needless to say, the legacy of the British Empire can be seen all around us. Many nations around the world have adopted the British legal framework, including principles like trial by jury and the presumption of innocence. Railways and government buildings built during British rule are still in use in many former colonies, including India, Pakistan, and Kenya. The cultural impact of the British Empire is also very apparent. It is the reason that India and Pakistan are two of the world's major cricketing nations. Another major consequence of the 7 Years' War was the rise of Prussia. After the war, Prussia was an established European power. Had the war gone differently, Prussia might have been wiped off the map, which would have totally altered the course of German history. Had that happened, the fragmented German states might never have unified. If they did unify, perhaps it would have been under Austrian leadership. If that were the case, the modern capital of Germany would be Vienna rather than Berlin. Number 5. Constantine's Civil War. Now for the third and final war that involved the Roman Empire. Constantine's Civil War is another of the less famous wars on the list. But the reason that I've included it is because it played a major role in the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. The war started in 306 AD when Constantine's father died unexpectedly while on campaign. Constantine was very popular with his father's men, and they declared him emperor. The young general, although untested as a ruler, had proven himself in battle, and the men saw in him the strength and charisma of an effective Roman leader. As Constantine solidified his position in France, another ambitious ruler emerged in Rome, Maxentius. In 306, Maxentius took power in Italy, challenging Constantine's claim to the Western Empire. The rivalry between the two men became increasingly bitter, and in 312, Constantine decided to confront Maxentius directly. He marched his forces toward Rome in a bid to take control of the entire Western Empire. That campaign would culminate in one of the most pivotal battles in history, the Battle of Milvian Bridge. According to legend, on the eve of the battle, Constantine experienced a vision that would change him forever. He reportedly saw a cross in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In hoc signo vinces," which means, "In this sign, you will conquer." That night, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol, the Chi Rho, on their shields. Constantine's army, inspired by this divine sign, engaged Maxentius' forces the next day at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. The battle was fierce, but Constantine's troops emerged victorious, and Maxentius perished in the Tiber River. Constantine entered Rome as a conqueror. He was now the undisputed ruler of the Western Roman Empire. With Maxentius defeated, Constantine turned his attention to the Eastern Empire. Initially, he made a power-sharing agreement with the Eastern Emperor Licinius, and in 313, the two men issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. However, the peace was short-lived. By 324, Constantine and Licinius were locked in their own struggle for supremacy as Constantine sought to take control of the entire empire. The final showdown came in 324 AD, and once again Constantine emerged victorious. The civil war was over, and Constantine took control of the entire Roman Empire. The reason Constantine's civil war is so important is because of what it did for Christianity. It transformed it from a persecuted faith to the empire's dominant religion. That was an enormous cultural and ethical revolution. The Roman Empire had been based on principles such as might is right and virtue and strength. Christianity introduced the idea that the strong had a duty to help the weak, with messages like "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." In the modern world, Christianity is the world's biggest religion, with 2.4 billion followers. Needless to say, the ways in which the world has been shaped by Christianity are effectively infinite. All of our cultural and moral values have been shaped to one degree or another by Christianity. Many of the biggest social and political movements of history were led by men who were deeply Christian. The abolition of slavery, for example, was led by men such as William Wilberforce and John Newton, both of whom were motivated by their deep Christian faith. We can also see the impact of Christianity in our architecture, language, music, and art. It is estimated that there are a whopping 37 million churches all over the world. It's possible that all of that enormous impact wouldn't have happened had it not been for Constantine's civil war, and in particular, the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Number 4, the Cold War. The Cold War is quite different from the other wars on the list because, really, it was a power struggle, a fight for dominance over the globe. The two belligerents, America and the Soviet Union, never actually fought a direct war against each other. That said, they fought indirectly many times in proxy wars that took place all over the world. The Cold War began in the aftermath of World War II in 1945. America and the Soviet Union had just allied to defeat Nazi Germany. But once the war was over, relations quickly cooled. The Soviet Union forcibly took control of Eastern Europe and set up puppet governments, and that was totally unacceptable to America. The two superpowers also followed totally incompatible ideologies. The US supported democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and dictatorship. Within 2 years of World War II ending, it was clear that the two superpowers were adversaries engaged in a power struggle for global dominance. As I said earlier, they never actually fought directly, but did fight indirectly through proxy wars. The first of those started in 1945 when China had a civil war, the war that I mentioned earlier. As in the other proxy wars, the Soviet Union supported the communist faction while America supported the nationalists. The war would eventually be won by the communists, led by Mao Zedong. As that was happening, a major incident occurred in Europe when the Soviets blockaded West Berlin in 1948. The Soviets controlled all of Eastern Europe, from East Germany to Romania, except for the small enclave of West Berlin. The Soviets wanted to take control of West Berlin, so they blockaded it, preventing any supplies from getting in. The US responded with an airlift to keep supplying the area with food and goods. Eventually, after almost a year, the Soviets gave up and lifted the blockade. Another major event happened in 1949 when the Soviets had their first successful nuclear bomb test. That totally changed the power dynamic of the Cold War. Until then, only America had nuclear weapons, but now the Soviet Union did as well. Very quickly, the two nations found themselves in an arms race to have the largest nuclear arsenal. 1949 would also see the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That was a response to the threat of Soviet expansion in Europe. Its goal was simple. If one NATO member was attacked, the others would come to its defense. The alliance would play a key role in controlling the spread of communism throughout the war. The next year, 1950, saw the start of another proxy war, the Korean War. That began when North Korea, which was communist, invaded South Korea, which was capitalist. America, the Soviet Union, and China all got heavily involved in the conflict, but after 3 years of fighting, there was no clear victor. Eventually, in 1953, there was a ceasefire, but no formal peace treaty was ever signed. The border between North and South Korea remains the same to this day. Those sorts of proxy wars happened all over the place throughout the Cold War. In 1955, a similar war started in Vietnam, with the communist North fighting the capitalist South. Then, in 1962, the world came the closest that it has ever come to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It began because the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, very close to the United States. The Americans found out about the missiles and demanded that they be removed. There was a tense standoff, and both sides prepared for nuclear war. After several days, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba and removing missiles that it had in Turkey. The crisis ended peacefully, but it showed how dangerous the Cold War was. That actually led to agreements where both sides would limit their nuclear arsenals. Throughout the 1970s, tensions eased for a while in what became known as détente. However, that ended in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which would turn into another proxy war. America supported the Mujahideen fighters who were fighting the Soviet-backed government. The war went extremely badly for the Soviet Union, and eventually it gave up and withdrew. The Cold War as a whole would eventually end simply because the Soviet Union collapsed. By the late 1980s, it was in a state of profound crisis and began to lose control of its puppet states in Eastern Europe. In 1989, a wave of popular protests led to the fall of communist regimes in many different countries. The Berlin Wall, the most famous symbol of the Cold War, fell in November of 1989. Eventually, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated, and its member states declared independence. On December 25, 1991, President Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. The Cold War was over. As you can imagine, there are numerous ways in which the effects of the Cold War can still be seen in the modern world. One of the most obvious is that many of the countries that the Soviet Union helped make communist are still communist. Some examples are China, Cuba, and North Korea. Another example of the Cold War's legacy is that it led to many technological advances. For example, the space race led to the launch of the first satellite and humans landing on the moon. Today, satellites are used in all sorts of things, such as GPS, weather forecasting, and monitoring natural disasters. The Cold War dramatically sped up the development of that technology. Perhaps the most prescient example of a consequence of the Cold War is the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which saw Moscow lose control of territories like the Baltics and Ukraine, which it had controlled for centuries. Since then, many of those nations have become more and more aligned with the West. Russia sees that as a threat to its influence, and in 2022, it invaded Ukraine, in large part because it was determined to stop it from moving closer to the West. Number 3. The early Muslim conquests. Now, to be clear, the Muslim conquests were not one single war, but a series of wars against various different states. That said, I wanted to include them on the list because the influence of the early Muslim conquests is so enormous in the modern world. For those that aren't familiar with how they happened, the main thing that you need to know about the early Muslim conquests is that they were astonishingly successful. They began in 622, and in only 130 years, Islam had expanded from just the Arabian Peninsula to a vast territory. What is even more astonishing is that they were fighting some of the strongest and most established empires of the time. In particular, I'm talking about the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid Empire. Those two empires had been around for centuries and were some of the most advanced states of the age. Despite that, the Muslims were able to totally humble them. They completely destroyed the Sassanid Empire and took a huge amount of territory from the Byzantines, including Egypt and the Holy Land. The breathtaking expansion didn't stop there. Over the next century, they made it as far west as Spain and as far east as Central Asia. The impact of the Muslim conquests on the modern world is obvious. Islam is the second biggest religion on the planet. If those conquests hadn't been so successful, Islam might have become a much smaller religion like Judaism or Sikhism. It might even have been extinguished entirely. One important question to ask is how the Muslims were able to achieve such success, particularly in their wars against the Eastern Romans and the Sassanids. It seems shocking that they were able to humble two rich and powerful empires. One of the biggest reasons for that is that the two empires had just finished a long and grueling war between themselves. From 602 to 628, the two superpowers were engaged in a 26-year-long struggle for dominance, which drained them and left them vulnerable. The Muslim conquests of those empires started almost immediately after the end of that war, and the weak and exhausted empires were unable to resist. Perhaps then, if we were to choose one war to represent the enormous impact of the Muslim conquests, it would actually be that war between the Eastern Romans and the Sassanids. If that war hadn't happened, the two empires might have been in a strong position to stop the Muslim conquerors in their tracks. Perhaps the Holy Land would have remained in Christian hands, and Islam would have become a much smaller force in the modern world. Number 2, World War II. Needless to say, there is no way that I could make a video about the most important wars in history without mentioning World War II. World War II was unique in many ways. It was the biggest war ever fought. It included the only time that humanity has ever used nuclear weapons. It also included the largest and most systematic genocide in human history. The legacy of World War II is still extremely visible in the modern world. If you're watching this video, you probably know the story of the war, but I think it's worth briefly going through it again. It began in Europe on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Germans combined rapid troop movements with tanks and air support to quickly overrun the Polish defenses, and within weeks, Poland was defeated. The first years of the war saw Nazi Germany take a huge amount of territory. After taking Poland, they turned north, invading Norway and Denmark in April 1940. In May, they struck west, taking Belgium, the Netherlands, and then France. Hitler then turned his attention to Britain. In what became known as the Battle of Britain, the German Air Force attempted to gain air supremacy over the Royal Air Force through a relentless bombing campaign. However, with the determined leadership of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Britain was able to fight off the German Air Force. Eventually, Germany gave up in October 1940, which was its first real failure of the war. Then, in June 1941, Germany launched the biggest invasion in history when it invaded the Soviet Union. 3 million men poured over the border and rapidly advanced toward Moscow. The Germans were initially very successful and reached the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad in only a few weeks. However, the harsh winter and the fierce Soviet resistance stopped the German advance. The big turning point was at the Battle of Stalingrad, where the Russians encircled and defeated about 1 million German and Italian men. That was a catastrophic loss for Germany and turned the tide of the war. While all that was happening, war was also raging in Asia. Japan had been rapidly expanding, taking Manchuria in 1931 and invading China in 1937. Tensions between Japan and the United States escalated throughout the 1930s, with the U.S. imposing economic sanctions in response to Japan's aggression. War between the two broke out on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan, officially joining World War II. Only a few months later, it won a decisive victory against Japan at the Battle of Midway. From that point on, the United States began a strategy of island hopping, capturing strategically important islands and gradually moving closer to Japan. The United States also helped with the war in Europe. In May 1943, The Allies drove German and Italian forces out of North Africa and then launched an invasion of Italy. The Italian leader, Benito Mussolini, was deposed, and the new Italian government surrendered to the Allies in September. However, German forces were able to take control of northern Italy and fought hard to defend it. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched a major amphibious invasion of Normandy, France. Spearheaded by American, British, and Canadian forces, the invasion marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. Despite fierce German resistance, the Allies were able to establish a beachhead and begin advancing through France. By August, Paris was liberated, and the Allies continued pushing eastward toward Germany. As the Allied forces closed in from the west, the Soviet Union advanced from the east, eventually reaching German soil. In April 1945, they captured Berlin, leading Hitler to commit suicide in his bunker. Germany surrendered on May 7th, marking the end of the war in Europe. In Asia, the United States had all but won the war, but it wasn't clear how to get Japan to surrender. Faced with the prospect of a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland, the United States opted to use a devastating new weapon. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, followed by a second bomb on Nagasaki on August 9th. The enormous destruction and loss of life led Japan to surrender on August 15, 1945. The war was over, having lasted 6 years, or even 8 if you include the war between Japan and China. Needless to say, the effects of World War II are very visible in the modern world. It was the reason that the Soviet Union was able to take control of all of Eastern Europe and impose communism on those nations. Something else that the Second World War caused was the creation of the United Nations. It was founded just a few months after the end of the war as an attempt to prevent such a destructive war ever taking place again. Many of the biggest ways in which World War II changed the world were actually related to the Holocaust, the systematic attempt to kill all the world's Jews. That led to many things, but one of the biggest was the creation of the State of Israel. There had long been people who wanted the creation of a Jewish state, but after the Holocaust, the decision was made to actually do it. Another big consequence of the Holocaust was the introduction of legislation to protect human rights. The Second World War would not only reshape the map of Europe, but the whole world. In the aftermath of the war, numerous countries gained independence from their European empires. That was because the European powers were weakened after the war, so they couldn't keep control of their colonies. A good example is India, which had growing demands for independence. Britain was totally exhausted, and in the end, it couldn't prevent India's independence. Many colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East would go through a similar process. World War II also led to important technological advancements. The need for accurate and rapid calculations during the war dramatically sped up progress in computing. The first ever programmable digital computer, called Colossus, was built in Britain to crack the Lorenz cipher used by the Germans. Of course, the most terrifying technological advancement was the creation of nuclear weapons. That began a new era of geopolitics and would set the stage for the Cold War that I talked about earlier. Before we get to my choice for the most important war in human history, I thought I'd mention a couple of wars that almost made the list, but didn't quite. The first is the American War of Independence. The impact of the founding of America on the modern world doesn't need to be explained. America is the most powerful country on Earth, the most important country. It is the one superpower on the planet. The importance of America is obvious from the way that it determines European policy on things such as the war in Ukraine. America decides how much support the countries of Europe are going to give to Ukraine. So, if America is so incredibly important in the modern world, why isn't American independence one of the most important wars in history? Well, it's because, for me, the thing that has made America so astonishingly important and powerful isn't actually that it got independence when it did. I think it's almost certain that America would have got independence eventually, just as Canada, Australia, and every other country in the British Empire eventually got independence. In my view, what has made America so powerful isn't that it got independence, but rather the way that it was founded, the decisions of the founding fathers, and the system of government that they came up with. Another honorable mention is the Napoleonic Wars. That was, without doubt, one of the biggest conflicts in human history. For example, Napoleon's invasion of Russia involved about 500,000 men. However, our list here isn't about which wars were the biggest, but rather which ones affect the modern world the most. Considering how enormous the conflict was, its influence isn't actually hugely obvious. For example, even though France was the major protagonist in the Napoleonic Wars, and at one point it dominated all of Europe, it gained almost no territory. That said, the conflict did, of course, have some effects on the modern world. One of the biggest is that it led to an increase in nationalism in places like Germany and Italy. At the time, those areas were made up of many small nations, but the invasions of Napoleon made them want to unite to better protect themselves. Another major consequence of the Napoleonic Wars was on the other side of the world, in the Americas. They led to the collapse of the Spanish Empire and the independence of Latin America. That said, I think those countries would have got independence eventually, so the Napoleonic Wars merely sped up that process. Now, for my choice for the most important war in human history. Number 1. The First World War. I put World War I as number 1 on the list because, simply, it ended the old world. I think the importance of a war can be determined to a large degree by how different the world looked after the war compared with before. And for me, no war changed the world as much as World War I. The map of Europe when the war ended in 1918 was unrecognizable from how it looked when it started in 1914. You probably know what happened in the war, but I'll quickly go over it again. It began after the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Bosnia on June 28, 1914. The assassin was a Serbian nationalist, and so Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the attack. They issued an ultimatum, and when Serbia didn't fully comply with it, Austria-Hungary declared war. That local conflict quickly escalated because of a complex web of alliances. Russia was allied with Serbia and began readying its military. Germany was allied with Austria-Hungary and declared war on Russia, and then on Russia's ally, France. To attack France, Germany invaded Belgium, which led Britain to declare war. 1 month after the assassination, all of Europe was at war. Germany quickly invaded France, hoping to defeat it as fast as possible before turning to fight Russia in the east. However, the French were able to stop the German advance just outside Paris. Both sides dug trenches, leading to trench warfare. On the Eastern Front, Germany and Austria-Hungary faced off against Russia. The Eastern Front was more mobile than the West and didn't see much trench warfare. The scale of the casualties was staggering. Russia, in particular, lost huge numbers of men, but the sheer size of its army kept it in the fight. Meanwhile, new fronts opened up all around the world. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, leading to battles in the Middle East. Fighting also broke out in Africa and Asia, as European powers clashed over their colonies. World War I saw the introduction of deadly new technologies such as machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery. Poison gas was first used in 1915 and caused horrifying injuries and deaths. Tanks and airplanes appeared for the first time, but those early versions were often unreliable. By 1917, all the participants were exhausted. Russia, weakened by internal unrest and heavy losses, saw its government collapse in a revolution. Power was then taken by the far-left Bolsheviks, who pulled Russia out of the war. Meanwhile, the United States entered the conflict. The arrival of fresh American troops and resources boosted Allied morale and gave them a significant advantage. That provoked Germany to launch a final series of desperate offensives on the Western Front, hoping to win quickly before the Americans arrived. Those offensives were initially quite successful, but the Allies were eventually able to push them back. By autumn of 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing. Bulgaria surrendered in September, followed by the Ottoman Empire in October, and Austria-Hungary in November. Eventually, Germany agreed to an armistice on November 11th, 1918. The next year, the Treaty of Versailles formally ended the war. Versailles imposed heavy penalties on Germany, stripping it of territory, limiting its military, and forcing it to pay reparations. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were both dismantled. The things that came out of World War I are as tragic as they're monumental. The collapse of the Russian Empire and the Russian Revolution led to the rise of communism and the Soviet Union. Communism, as promoted by the Soviet Union, would go on to kill about 100 million people over the next few decades. If World War I hadn't happened, the Russian Revolution probably wouldn't have happened, and Russia wouldn't have become communist. In turn, many other nations would have been less likely to become communist, like China or Cuba. Before the revolution, Russia had actually been slowly liberalizing and becoming more democratic. It's possible that it would have continued on that path and become a normal democracy, like the rest of Europe. As it is, the Russian Revolution ruptured relations between the West and Russia, and they have never fully recovered. Even today, the bad relations between the West and Russia can be traced back to the Russian collapse in World War I. Another empire that collapsed as a result of World War I is the Ottoman Empire. Before the war, much of the Muslim world was part of one state ruled from Istanbul. After the war, the empire's territories were divided among the victorious Allied powers under the Sykes-Picot Agreement that led to the creation of modern states such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, often under British or French mandates. The division of the region planted the seeds of many modern conflicts. The borders were badly drawn, often ignoring ethnic and religious divisions, which led to tensions that still exist. Another hugely important empire that collapsed after World War I was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That was a large and very ethnically diverse empire ruled from Vienna. Spanning much of Central and Eastern Europe, the empire was home to numerous ethnic groups such as Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Serbs, Croats, Romanians, and others, each with distinct languages and cultures. For a long time, many of those groups had been wanting to be self-governed, to have their own state. Throughout the war, those fractures deepened, and the different ethnic groups demanded independence. When Austro-Hungary was defeated in the war, it disintegrated into a patchwork of new nations. New countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were created, while other parts of the empire were annexed by nations like Poland and Italy. Obviously, one of the biggest outcomes of World War I is that it directly led to the rise of Hitler in World War II. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, imposed harsh penalties on Germany, including territorial losses, military restrictions, and crippling reparations. Germany was left humiliated, leading to a huge amount of resentment among the German people. That created fertile ground for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to rise to power. Hitler capitalized on the anger and desperation of the German population. He promised to reject the Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany's former glory. He pushed the idea that Jews had sabotaged Germany's war effort and were to blame for all the ills in society. That helped him come to power, and once in power, he began invading other nations, which ultimately started World War II. While the First World War was the reason that Germany as a whole went crazy, it might actually have been the reason that Hitler himself became so consumed with hate. It is debated when exactly Hitler became an obsessive anti-Semite. But it's known that he hadn't always been like that. In his early life, he actually had personal and business relationships with Jews in Vienna. He also had a Jewish doctor. It's very likely that the trauma he suffered in World War I played a part in Hitler becoming what he ultimately became. I think World War I's transformation of Hitler personally is almost like a microcosm of the transformation of Germany as a whole. One of the unique and, frankly, strange aspects of World War I is how it seemingly came out of nowhere. Thousands of books have been published on the causes of World War I, which I think demonstrates how complicated and inexplicable it was. In my view, the war was definitely avoidable. None of Europe's leaders wanted the war, at least not the war that actually happened. The majority of them were desperate to prevent it. When the German ambassador handed Germany's declaration of war to Russia, he then burst into tears. The British Prime Minister also cried on the eve of war. That is why World War I is, for me, the most important war ever. It is also perhaps the greatest catastrophe in human history.